The children's laughter stopped the moment chaos erupted. Bumpy Johnson felt a bullet graze his neck as mothers grabbed their kids and ran for safety. The Genovese family had just crossed an unforgivable line, disrupting his Harlem charity event. Within 24 hours, their operations would face consequences they'd never forget. Every August, when the summer heat still hung heavy over Harlem's streets, Bumpy Johnson did something that confused outsiders but made perfect sense to those who truly knew him. He organized the biggest back-to-school charity event the neighborhood had ever seen. This wasn't some publicity stunt or attempt to clean up his image. This was personal. This was about the community that had raised him, protected him, and stood by him through decades of struggle and triumph. The year was 1962, and Bumpy had been a fixture in Harlem for over 30 years. To the outside world, he was a notorious figure in New York's underworld, a man whose name carried weight in both legitimate and illegitimate circles. But in Harlem, he was something different. He was the man who made sure elderly widows could pay their rent. He was the person who quietly funded scholarships for promising students. He was the protector who kept outside predators from exploiting the community he called home. St. Philip's Episcopal Church Community Center had become the traditional venue for Bumpy's annual event. The large hall could accommodate hundreds of families, and the church's central location made it accessible to everyone in the neighborhood. Reverend Clayton had initially been hesitant about allowing someone with Bumpy's reputation to use the space. But after seeing the genuine impact on struggling families, he'd become one of the event's biggest supporters. This particular Saturday afternoon, the community center buzzed with positive energy. Long tables lined the walls, stacked high with notebooks, pencils, backpacks, and school supplies. Volunteers moved through the crowd, helping mothers select the right sizes for their children. In one corner, local barbers offered free back-to-school haircuts. In another, seamstresses measured kids for new clothes. The smell of food drifted from the kitchen, where volunteers prepared free meals for attendees. Bumpy moved through the crowd with ease, stopping to greet families by name, asking about grandparents, remembering details from previous years. He wore one of his signature, well-tailored suits, but he'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, helping carry boxes and organize supplies. His presence wasn't intimidating. Here it was reassuring. The parents knew that with Bumpy Johnson involved, this event would run smoothly and their children would be taken care of. What made this event sacred in the unwritten codes of New York's organized crime world was its pure purpose. This wasn't a front for illegal activity. This wasn't a meeting place for criminal business. This was genuinely about helping children succeed in school. And there was an understanding, respected across all 5 families. That community events, especially those involving children, were off limits. They were neutral ground, sacred space. To violate this rule wasn't just bad business. It was a fundamental betrayal of the codes that kept their world functioning. Bumpy had minimal security at these events intentionally. He wanted families to feel comfortable, not like they were walking into a heavily guarded compound. His longtime associate, Willie Thompson, stood near the entrance, but he looked more like another volunteer than a bodyguard. A few other trusted men were scattered throughout the crowd, but they were there to help organize, not to intimidate. As Bumpy handed a young girl a brand new backpack and watched her face light up with joy, he had no idea that several blocks away, 4 men were receiving their final instructions for an operation that would shatter the peace of this perfect afternoon. The tension between Bumpy Johnson and the Genovese crime family had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. At the center of the dispute was Harlem's numbers racket. It's the illegal lottery that generated enormous revenue for whoever controlled it. For years, Bumpy had maintained a careful balance, operating semi-independently while paying tribute to the Italian families that technically held power over New York's organized crime landscape. But times were changing. The Genovese family, under the calculating leadership of Vincent the Chin Gigante, is expanding its operations and tightening its grip on various territories throughout the city. They wanted a larger percentage of Harlem's profits, and they wanted direct control rather than working through intermediaries like Bumpy. To them, it was simple business. To Bumpy, it was an outsider trying to extract wealth from a community without giving anything back. The real problem was Tommy Russo, one of Gigante's ambitious lieutenants. Russo was a third-generation mobster. He's grown up hearing stories about how the Italian families dominated New York. He saw Bumpy's independence as disrespectful, an affront to the natural order as he understood it, while older, wiser heads in the organization counseled patience and negotiation. Russo pushed for a more aggressive approach. Tommy Russo believed that Bumpy's power came primarily from reputation and mystique. He thought that a dramatic show of force would shatter that image and bring Bumpy to the negotiating table on the Genovese family's terms. He sold this plan to his superiors by emphasizing how vulnerable Bumpy would be at his charity events, surrounded by civilians with minimal protection, his attention divided. It would be a message, Russo argued, not an assassination. Close call that would remind Bumpy who really held power in New York. What Russo fundamentally misunderstood was the source of Bumpy's actual power. It wasn't just fear or reputation. It was loyalty. It was decades of genuine relationships built on mutual respect and support. It was the fact that when Bumpy walked through Harlem, he wasn't just protected by hired muscle. He was protected by an entire community. Saw him as one of their own. The team Russo assembled consisted of 4 experienced operators from the Bronx, men who didn't know Harlem's streets or its people. They'd been watching the community center for 2 days, noting the patterns, identifying the best approach and escape routes. They saw the minimal security and assumed it meant Bumpy was careless. They didn't realize it meant he felt safe because he was surrounded by people who would protect him without being asked. The plan was straightforward. Drive by the community center, fire several shots through the open doors to create chaos and send a message, then disappear into the city before anyone could respond effectively. In Russo's mind, it was perfect. Bumpy would be humiliated, maybe wounded, and would understand that the Genovese family could reach him anywhere, anytime. The community would see him as vulnerable, and his legendary status would take a serious hit. But there was a fatal flaw in this reasoning that Russo, in his arrogance, never considered. Attacking Bumpy was one thing that was business, and business sometimes got violent. But attacking him while he was surrounded by mothers and children during an event dedicated to helping the community's youngest members, that wasn't just crossing a line. That was declaring a type of war that Russo and his superiors were completely unprepared to fight. At exactly 2:47 p.m. on that August afternoon, Bumpy Johnson was kneeling beside a nervous 7-year-old boy named Marcus, helping him choose between 2 different notebooks. Marcus couldn't decide between one with a superhero on the cover and another with a baseball theme. Bumpy was patiently explaining that Marcus could actually take both when something caught his attention. It was a subtle thing, a kind of detail most people would miss. A black Cadillac had pulled up across the street, parking in a spot that gave a clear view of the community center's entrance. The car was too clean, too new. And the 2 men visible in the front seats were sitting too still, their attention too focused. In Bumpy's world, you survived by noticing things that didn't quite fit the pattern. And this car, at this moment, in this spot, didn't fit. Bumpy's hand instinctively went to Marcus's shoulder, pulling the boy slightly behind him as he started to rise. That's when the rear windows of the Cadillac rolled down, and he saw the glint of metal catching the afternoon sunlight. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. It's the way it does when your brain suddenly shifts into survival mode and every detail becomes sharp and crystal clear. The first shots shattered the peaceful afternoon like thunder breaking through a clear sky. The bullets weren't aimed with precision. They were meant to spray through the open doors and create maximum chaos. Volunteers screamed. Mothers grabbed their children and dropped to the floor or ran for the back exits. Cables overturned, sending school supplies scattering across the polished floor. The carefully organized event descended into pandemonium in seconds. Bumpy felt the impact before he heard the specific shot that caused it. A burning sensation across the left side of his neck, like someone had drawn a red-hot wire across his skin. The bullet had grazed him, close enough to tear through skin, but far enough from major arteries to leave him standing. If he'd been facing a slightly different direction, if he'd stood up a second earlier or later, the outcome would have been very different. Willie Thompson, who'd been near the entrance helping an elderly woman carry supplies to her car, reacted with the instincts of someone who'd survived decades in a dangerous world. He drew his own weapon and returned fire toward the Cadillac. Not trying to hit anyone, but sending a clear message. This wasn't going to be an unopposed attack. The shots forced the men in the car to duck, disrupting their plan. But Willie wasn't the only one responding. Within seconds, men emerged from shops and apartments along the street, several of them armed. These weren't Bumpy's employees or associates. They were community members who understood what was happening and weren't going to let outside aggressors attack their neighborhood with impunity. The Cadillac's driver, suddenly facing return fire from multiple directions, made the decision to abort and speed away. Inside the community center, the scene was heartbreaking. Children were crying, some hurt in the stampede toward safety, others simply terrified by the sudden violence. A teenage volunteer had been grazed by a ricochet fragment, bleeding from her arm. An older man had been knocked down in the rush and appeared to have injured his hip. A young mother had a cut on her forehead from hitting a table corner as she'd shielded her infant. Bumpy's first action, despite the blood running down his neck and soaking into his collar, was to start helping people. He moved through the chaos with remarkable calm, checking on children first, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're okay, baby. You're safe now. Let's find your mama." He helped the elderly man into a chair. He grabbed a clean towel from the kitchen and pressed it against the teenage girl's arm. Elevating it to slow the bleeding, someone handed him another towel for his own neck, and he pressed it against the wound almost absently, more concerned with everyone else's welfare than his own. Parents were frantically searching for their children in the confusion, and Bumpy helped reunite families, his presence somehow calming despite everything that had just happened. Everyone's here. All the children are accounted for. Nobody's missing. The police arrived within 10 minutes, sirens cutting through the neighborhood. Officers rushed in, expecting to find a massacre, and instead found a community already regaining its composure. Organized by a bleeding man in an expensive suit who was helping sweep up broken glass and right overturned tables. The lead detective recognized Bumpy immediately and approached with a mixture of professional duty and personal wariness. But when the questions came, Bumpy offered nothing useful. He hadn't seen the car clearly. He didn't recognize anyone. He had no idea why someone might target the event. The code of silence held firm, not just from Bumpy, but from every witness in the building. Nobody had seen anything helpful. Nobody could identify anyone. Nobody wanted to cooperate with official channels because they knew that in this neighborhood, justice didn't come from police reports and courtrooms. As Bumpy finally allowed someone to properly bandage his neck, pressing a clean handkerchief against the wound that had narrowly missed ending his life, his face showed no fear or shock. Instead, there was something else in his eyes, a cold, calculating anger that anyone who truly knew him would recognize. The Genovese family had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They'd brought violence to children. They'd terrorized families at an event meant to help them. And that kind of violation demanded a response that would be remembered for years to come. When the ambulance arrived, Bumpy waved it away from himself and directed the paramedics toward the others who'd been hurt. The teenage volunteer with the arm wound needed proper medical attention. The elderly man with the injured hip should be checked for fractures. The young mother with the head cut should be examined for concussion. Bumpy's neck could wait. In that moment, his priorities revealed everything about who he was and where his loyalties lay. The police detective tried to pressure him. "Mr. Johnson, you're bleeding significantly. You need to go to the hospital." But Bumpy simply shook his head, maintaining pressure on the wound with his handkerchief. "I'll see my own doctor, okay? These people need the ambulance more than I do." There was no arguing. With that tone, and the detective knew it, when Bumpy Johnson made a decision, it stood. As the immediate chaos settled into organized cleanup, information was already flowing through Harlem's invisible network. The street had eyes everywhere, and those eyes had seen everything. Multiple witnesses had noted the Cadillac's license plate. Someone had recognized one of the shooters from previous encounters in the Bronx shop. Owners who'd responded with weapons had seen the direction. The car had fled and had associates tracking its route through the city. This network operated on principles of loyalty and mutual protection that outsiders could never fully understand. It wasn't controlled by Bumpy, it existed independently, built on decades of community bonds and shared experience. But when something threatened that community, especially something as sacred as an event for children, the network activated with remarkable efficiency. Information flowed upward through trusted channels, reaching the people who needed to know within hours of the incident. By the time Bumpy finally left the community center, having personally thanked every volunteer and checked on every family, he had a clear picture of exactly who had attacked and why. The Cadillac belonged to a Genovese-connected car service. The shooters were known associates of Tommy Russo. The order had come from high enough in the organization that this wasn't a rogue operation. It was sanctioned, planned, deliberate. Bumpy's emergency meeting took place at the Palm Cafe, a small restaurant that had been serving Harlem for 30 years. The owner, a woman named Dorothy, who'd known Bumpy since they were teenagers, locked the front door and pulled the shades. In the back room, around a table scarred by decades of use, Bumpy gathered with his closest and most trusted associates. These weren't just employees or enforcers, they were men he'd known for decades, who'd stood with him through wars and peace, who understood both the business and the principles that guided it. Willie Thompson was there, still angry about how close the bullet had come to killing his oldest friend. James Jet Turner, who managed most of Bumpy's numbers operations, sat taking notes on a small pad of paper. Raymond Ray Foster, the strategic thinker of the group, was already analyzing options and consequences. Clarence Miller, the oldest of them all, prided the historical perspective and wisdom that came from surviving 50 years in their world. Bumpy laid out what they knew: the attackers, their affiliations, the likely chain of command that had approved the operation. Then he asked the question that would determine everything that followed. What happens if we do nothing? The answer was clear to everyone in the room. Doing nothing meant accepting that the Genovese family could attack them during community events. It meant showing weakness. It meant that other organizations would test those boundaries. It meant that next time, someone might die. They brought war to our children, Bumpy said quietly. The bandage on his neck, a visible reminder of how close he'd come to death. They did it deliberately, knowing exactly where we were and what we were doing. That's not business. That's not a negotiation tactic, okay? That's a fundamental violation of every code we've ever operated under. The decision wasn't made hastily. Discussed options, considered consequences, thought through second and third order effects. They talked about what the other families would think, how the commission might respond, whether this would trigger a larger conflict. But every analysis led to the same conclusion. Some violations demanded a response significant enough to ensure they'd never happened again. By midnight, they had intelligence on 4 Genovese operations. A safe house in the Bronx where organization members stayed between jobs. A gambling operation in East Harlem that generated significant revenue. A warehouse in Washington Heights where they stored contraband goods. Canned Tommy Russo's personal business headquarters. A building where he conducted his operations away from his family home. Bumpy's instructions were precise and non-negotiable. No one gets seriously hurt. Confirm that no civilians are present before any action. Was to destroy property and disrupt operations. Not to create bodies that would demand blood vengeance and escalate into a war nobody wanted. This had to be devastating enough to send an unmistakable message, but controlled enough to give the Genovese family a way to accept it and move on. The team assembled for the operation consisted of 8 men, each chosen for their reliability, discipline, and commitment to the community. These weren't wild young kids looking to make a reputation. They were experienced, careful operators who understood exactly what was at stake. They would move with military precision, execute the plan exactly as designed, okay, and disappear before anyone could respond. As the meeting broke up in the early hours of the morning, Bumpy stayed behind with Clarence, the oldest and wisest of his associates. You think this is the right move? He asked, seeking perspective from someone whose judgment he trusted absolutely. Clarence was quiet for a long moment before responding. They attacked children, Bumpy. What happened today can never be allowed to happen again. This is the only language they understand. At exactly 3 a.m., 12 hours after bullets had shattered the peace of a children's charity event, the first response began. The Bronx Safe House on Webster Avenue. It's a 3-story building that looked like any other in the working-class neighborhood. Ground floor was a closed storefront. Upper floors served as temporary housing for Genovese associates between jobs. Intelligence confirmed that 4 organization members were currently staying there. No civilians present. Bumpy's team approached with practiced precision. 2 men disabled the exterior lights and covered the building's exits. Others positioned themselves with a clear view of every window. The signal was given, and within seconds, items designed to create significant fire were delivered through first and second floor windows. The building's interior began burning almost immediately, flames consuming the old wood structure with frightening speed. The men inside had seconds to react. Fire alarms screamed, smoke filled the stairwells. They barely had time to grab essential items before evacuating through the back exit, where they found their escape route blocked and their vehicles disabled. Nobody was hurt, but the message was received. Get out and don't come back. By the time fire trucks arrived, the upper floors were fully engulfed. The building would be a total loss. At 4:15 a.m., the second target was hit, the East Harlem gambling operation ran out of a basement space beneath a legitimate restaurant. The establishment was closed at this hour, the restaurant owner having been quietly warned earlier to stay away. 4 Genovese soldiers ran the overnight gambling operation, serving high-stakes players who preferred doing business in the dark. Ours Bumpy's team confirmed no civilians present before proceeding. The method was the same: quick, devastating, no time for response. The gambling den's expensive equipment was destroyed. Money that would have been collected and counted was seized. Records that tracked debts and payments were taken or burned. When the operators fled through the emergency exit, They found their weapons removed from where they'd been stored and their communication lines cut. The Genovese family had just lost a significant revenue stream and all the intelligence those records contained. The third location presented more complexity. The Washington Heights warehouse stored various contraband goods and cigarettes, stolen merchandise, illegal liquor. It was a purely commercial operation with no residential component, but the building shared walls with other businesses. This required more careful execution. Bumpy's team waited until they could confirm the exact locations of the stored goods, then created a controlled fire that destroyed the Genovese inventory while minimizing risk to neighboring structures. Warehouse operation was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Genovese family. Replacing the inventory would take months and significant capital. More importantly, the destruction would disrupt their supply chains throughout the city. Businesses that relied on those goods would have to find other suppliers. Relationships, carefully built over years, would be damaged. The financial impact would ripple through their operations for a long time. The final target was the most personal and the most risky. Tommy Russo's business headquarters. This was a professional office building where Russo conducted the administrative side of his operations. Records, money, communication, equipment, all the infrastructure required to manage a criminal enterprise. The building had other tenants, legitimate businesses that had nothing to do with Russo's activities. The precision required for this operation was extraordinary. Bumpy's team identified Russo's specific suite, confirmed no one else was in the building at this hour, disabled the fire suppression systems only in Russo's space, and executed a surgical strike that destroyed only his operation. When firefighters arrived, they found a single office suite completely gutted while the rest of the building remained untouched. It was a demonstration of capability that would not be lost on anyone who understood what they were seeing by sunrise. All 4 operations were complete. Team members had dispersed. Tools and materials were disposed of in ways that would never be traced. And physical evidence had been minimized or eliminated. The Genovese family had lost 4 significant operational locations, substantial amounts of money in inventory, and valuable records and intelligence. But this was crucial: nobody had been killed. Nobody had even been seriously injured. This wasn't random violence or uncontrolled retaliation. This was a calculated, proportional response designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. Bumpy had matched the violation: you attacked a community event. I disrupted your business operations. He'd demonstrated capability: I can reach you wherever you operate. And he'd shown restraint. Could have killed people, but chose not to. It's giving you room to accept this and move on, rather than demanding blood vengeance. As news of the overnight operations reached Harlem, the community's response was telling. There was no public celebration, no bragging or boasting. Instead, there was quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and a clear message sent. You don't attack our children. You don't disrupt events meant to help our community. There are consequences for crossing those lines, and those consequences will be swift, certain, and precisely calibrated to match the offense. Bumpy himself maintained his regular schedule that day, visiting the families who'd been at the community center, checking on those who'd been injured, reassuring parents that the event would continue next year and would be even better. The bandage on his neck served as a visible reminder of what had happened, but his demeanor showed no fear or uncertainty. He was calm, confident, and completely in control, exactly the image he needed to project in this critical moment. When Vincent the Chin Gigante received the first report about the Webster Avenue safehouse burning, his initial reaction was measured curiosity. Buildings caught fire in New York all the time. But when the second call came about the East Harlem gambling den, then the third about the warehouse, his expression shifted to something much darker. By the time he heard about Tommy Russo's headquarters, he understood exactly what had happened and what it meant. Gigante immediately called an emergency meeting of his senior leadership. These were men who'd helped build the Genovese family into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. Decades survived wars, navigated complex political situations, and maintained their position through decades of change. They understood strategy, consequences, and the unwritten rules that governed their world. Tommy Russo entered that meeting knowing his position was precarious. He'd advocated for the charity event attack, sold it as a smart tactical move that would bring Bumpy to heel. Instead, it had triggered a response that cost the family significant resources and, more importantly, made them look weak. 4 locations hit in one night, operations disrupted across the city, and not a single arrest or clue left behind for authorities. It was embarrassing. The debate that followed was intense but professional. Some argued for immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Others pointed out that escalation would be extremely costly and might trigger intervention from the commission, the ruling body that theoretically maintained order among New York's 5 families. The older, more experienced members reminded everyone of the fundamental problem. Rousseau had violated the unwritten rule about community events, and everyone in their world knew it. You attacked him at a charity event for children, one capo said bluntly. If you didn't just go after Bumpy, you terrorized mothers and kids. Nobody's going to shed tears that you lost some buildings. Hell, the other families are probably laughing at us for being stupid enough to cross that line in the first place. The commission didn't officially intervene, but informal inquiries came through various channels. The Lucchese family wanted to know if this was going to escalate into a larger conflict. The Colombo family expressed concern about stability. The Gambino family, always calculating, seemed to be assessing whether the Genovese weakness created opportunities they could exploit. The message was clear. Handle this situation. Don't let it grow into something that threatens everyone's interests. Tommy Russo faced severe consequences. He was stripped of his position managing Harlem operations. Significant financial penalties were imposed. He would personally cover a portion of the losses from the destroyed locations. There was serious discussion about whether more permanent measures were required, but ultimately, pragmatism prevailed. Russo had been reckless and stupid, but killing him wouldn't undo the damage or improve their strategic position. The political calculation was complex. On one hand, the Genovese family couldn't appear to accept the destruction of their operations without response. That would signal weakness throughout the criminal underworld. On the other hand, Bumpy had been strategically brilliant in how he'd structured his retaliation. He'd destroyed property, not people. He'd matched the violation proportionally. He'd given them room to accept it and move on without demanding blood vengeance that would trigger an endless cycle of violence. The final meeting took place 3 weeks after the charity event attack. In a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy that had been serving as neutral ground for delicate negotiations for decades. The owner knew how to ensure privacy, and both sides trusted that what was said there would remain confidential. This wasn't an official sit-down in the formal sense, just 2 parties having dinner and reaching an understanding. Bumpy arrived wearing another of his impeccably tailored suits. The stitches on his neck wound, visible, but healing well. He came with Willie Thompson and 1 other associate, making it clear this wasn't about intimidation, but about respect and serious discussion. The Genovese representatives included 2 senior capos, who had the authority to speak for Gigante and make binding agreements. The conversation was professional and respectful. Both sides acknowledged the sequence of events without assigning blame or making excuses. The Genovese representatives expressed regret that the charity event had been disrupted and children had been frightened. Bumpy acknowledged that his response had been forceful, but emphasized it had been carefully controlled to avoid casualties. Nobody apologized directly. That wasn't how their world worked, but the understanding was clear. The terms negotiated that evening went beyond just ending the immediate conflict. They established protocols for how disputes would be handled in the future. A clear channel of communication was established so that misunderstandings wouldn't escalate into violence. Specific geographic and functional boundaries were defined, clarifying who controlled what activities in which territories. Most importantly, the principle of protecting community events became formalized, with both sides agreeing to spread this understanding to other organizations. The compensation for the injured civilians was confirmed and expanded. Beyond the immediate medical expenses, there would be ongoing support for the teenage girl whose arm had been injured, ensuring she could afford college when the time came. The elderly man with the hip injury would receive assistance with his rehabilitation and home care. The young mother would find unexpected help with childcare costs. None of it was presented as payoff or a hush money. It was simply making things right. When the meeting concluded, both sides shook hands with genuine respect. This wasn't friendship, but it was professional acknowledgement between people who understood the complexities of their world. The Genovese representatives left knowing they'd avoided a potentially devastating conflict. Bumpy left knowing he'd protected his community, established boundaries that would be respected for years to come. The next year's charity event was indeed twice as large and twice as well attended. Parents who might have been afraid after the previous year's violence showed up in even greater numbers, bringing their children and their neighbors. The message was clear: the community wouldn't be intimidated or driven away from something positive. Bumpy increased security, but did so discreetly, ensuring families still felt welcome and comfortable. The event also attracted attention from other community leaders and organizations. What Bumpy had started as a personal initiative became a model for other neighborhood programs. Local churches, community centers, and civic groups organized similar events, creating a network of support that extended far beyond what any one person could accomplish. Bumpy's charity event became the flagship example of community empowerment. His reputation in Harlem reached new heights after the incident. He'd already been respected as someone who protected the neighborhood and gave back to those in need. But now there was an added dimension. He was the man who'd faced down one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations and forced them to respect the community's boundaries. Stories of how he'd checked on the children before tending to his own wound circulated widely. People talked about how precisely the retaliation had been executed, destroying enemy operations without causing casualties. This reputation had practical effects on his position in Harlem's complex ecosystem. Young people who might have been tempted to work for outside organizations stayed loyal to local leadership. Business owners felt more confident operating in the neighborhood, knowing there was protection against outside predators. Community programs found it easier to attract volunteers and resources. The entire neighborhood benefited from the strength Bumpy had. Demonstrated the principle established during this conflict, that community events were sacred grounded spread to other organizations and territories. It became part of the informal code that governed how New York's criminal world interacted with civilian populations. Violations still occurred occasionally, but they became rarer and faced unified opposition when they did happen. The understanding that attacking during community events was crossing an unacceptable line became widely accepted. For Bumpy personally, the incident reinforced core principles he'd operated under for decades. Power wasn't just about violence or intimidation, it was about loyalty, its community support, and the willingness to protect what mattered. His most valuable asset wasn't money or territory. It was the trust and respect of the people he served. As long as he maintained that foundation, he could face any challenge from any opponent. The charity event continued annually until Bumpy's death in 1968. Each year, it grew larger, served more families, and distributed more resources. became an institution in Harlem, something people planned for and looked forward to. And every year, without fail, Bumpy was there personally, helping organize, greeting families, making sure every child got what they needed. The event was never attacked again. The story of what happened that August afternoon in 1962 became legendary in Harlem. It's passed down through generations like an essential piece of community history. Elderly residents who were there still tell younger people about the day gunfire interrupted a children's event, and how Bumpy Johnson made sure that such a violation never happened again. The details might vary in the retelling, but the core message remains constant. The community was sacred, and protecting it was worth any cost. The understanding that emerged from this conflict has fundamentally shaped how organized crime interacted with Harlem's community for years afterward. Other organizations learned that there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, lines that triggered responses far more costly than any potential gain. Community events, schools, churches, these became recognized as spaces where criminal conflicts didn't extend. It wasn't perfect, and violations still occurred, but they became the exception rather than the norm. Bumpy Johnson's legacy is complex and contradictory in many ways. He was undeniably involved in illegal activities that caused harm. He operated in a violent world and used violence when he deemed it necessary. But he was also a man who genuinely cared about his community, who used his position and resources to help people who had no other protection, who established principles that made life safer for ordinary families. History resists simple categorization, and Bumpy resists it more than most. The charity event itself continued long after Bumpy's death, carried on by others who'd been inspired by his example. Modern-day Harlem still has similar programs, many run by people who grew up hearing stories about Bumpy's dedication to helping children succeed in school. The specifics have changed with the times, but the underlying principle that those who have resources should share them with those who don't remains fundamental to Harlem's community. Identity. What makes this story particularly resonant is what it reveals about the nature of power and loyalty. Bumpy Johnson couldn't match the Genovese family's resources or military strength in any direct sense. But he had something they couldn't replicate: genuine connection to a community that saw him as one of their own. That connection provided intelligence, protection, support, and legitimacy that no amount of money or firepower could purchase. It was the foundation of his power, and the reason he could face down much larger organizations. The principle. Bumpy demonstrated that true power comes from the people's loyalty, not just from fear or force, remains relevant today. Leaders in any field who understand this principle, who invest in genuine relationships and deliver real value to those they serve, build foundations that can withstand tremendous pressure. Those who rely purely on position or intimidation find their power evaporates the moment they face serious challenges. For the people of Harlem who lived through this era, Bumpy Johnson represents a complicated but important part of their history. He was a product of circumstances that forced people to create their own systems of protection and support when official institutions failed them. He operated in a world where violence was sometimes necessary for survival. But within that world, he established principles of community protection and mutual support that left a lasting positive impact. The final lesson of this story is about proportional response and strategic thinking. Bumpy could have responded to the charity event attack with indiscriminate violence, could have killed Genovese family members, and triggered an all-out war. Instead, he calibrated his response perfectly, devastating enough to ensure the message was received, controlled enough to give his opponents a way to accept it and move on. That kind of strategic discipline, that ability to see beyond immediate anger to long-term consequences, separated him from common criminals, and made him a true leader. Today, the corner where St. Philip's Episcopal Church Community Center once stood has changed, as all of New York constantly changes. But the memory of what happened there in August 1962 lives on in the stories passed down through families, in the community programs that continue Bumpy's legacy of giving back, and in the understanding that protecting what matters, especially children and community, is worth any sacrifice. That's the real story of Bumpy Johnson, beyond the legend. And the myth? A man who understood that his power meant nothing if he didn't use it to protect the people who trusted him.